Hi, my name is Latasha Lorez, and I will be presenting Our Nig by Harriet E. Adams Wilson. This is a picture of Harriet E. Wilson's memorial statue that was dedicated in 2006 in the Milford, New Hampshire's Bicentennial Park. This slide shows the homestead where Mrs. Wilson was an indentured servant until the age of 18. All right, on to some biographical information about Harriet Wilson. Harriet E. Wilson was born in Melford, New Hampshire on March 15, 2025, the daughter of Joshua Green, an African-American hooper of barrels, and Margaret Ann Adams Smith, a washerwoman of Irish ancestry. Her father died when she was very young, and her mother abandoned her at the farm of Nehemiah Hayward Jr., a well-to-do Milford farmer. As an orphan, Adams was made an indentured servant to the Hayward family, a customary way for society to arrange support at the time. In exchange for her labor, she received room, board, and training in life skills. And for those of you who may not know what an indentured servant is, the term originated when people coming to America could not afford the trip. They would usually pay someone for their travel, and then they were bound to that person for usually a term of about 7 years of service. When that term of service was over, they were free to go on about their lives. After the end of her indenture, Hattie Adams, as she was then known, worked as a house servant and a seamstress in households in New Hampshire and in central and western Massachusetts. She married Thomas Wilson in Melford on October 6, 1851. Thomas Wilson had been traveling around New England giving lectures based on his life as an escaped slave when he met Hattie Adams. Although he continued to periodically lecture in churches and town squares, he soon confided in her that he was never in bondage. He had never seen the South, and that his illiterate speeches were humbugs for hungry abolitionists. Wilson abandoned Harriet soon after they married. Pregnant and ill, Harriet Wilson was sent to the Hillsborough County, New Hampshire Poor Farm in Goffstown, New Hampshire, where her only son, George Mason Wilson, was born in 1852. Soon after George's birth, Thomas Wilson reappeared in her life and took her and her son away from the poor farm. Thomas Wilson returned to sea and died soon after. Harriet Wilson returned her son to the care of the poor farm. During this time, while working as a dressmaker in Boston, Wilson wrote Our Nig, which was published on September 5, 1859. This was the first novel written by an African-American woman and the first publication of any black person known. As Wilson explains in the preface, the book was an attempt to get her son back. Quote, "Deserted by kindred, disabled by failing health, I am forced to some experiment which shall aid me in maintaining myself and child without extinguishing this feeble life." End quote. Her son died, tragically, of fever on February 15, 1860, 6 months after the book's publication. For nearly 20 years, from 1879 to 1897, she was a housekeeper of a boarding house in a 2-story dwelling at 15 Village Street. She rented out rooms, collected rents, and provided basic maintenance. Despite Wilson's active and fruitful life after Our Nig, there is no evidence that she ever wrote anything else for publication. On June 28, 1900, Hattie E. Wilson died in the Quincy Hospital in Quincy, Massachusetts. In 1981, Henry Louis Gates Jr., a literary theorist with a particular interest in the works of African American writers, was shown the original edition at a Manhattan bookstore and saved Our Nig from its literary graveyard in 1982. Gates republished it in 1983 with his discoveries that the author was African American and that the story was largely autobiographical. He confirms that that period historians, bibliophiles, and biographers alike neglected mentioning Wilson's literary effort. Gates could only find 5 scant references to the novel in the 124 years of criticism following its publication. Well, now let's get on to the summary of the story. I'll first introduce you to some of the characters who we'll be looking at. Meg, the mother of Fredo. She is a poverty-stricken white woman, shunned by society. She finds love and happiness with a black man by the name of Jim. The couple produces 2 children. However, after Jim dies, Meg abandons her responsibility as a mother and runs off with another black man, leaving Fredo with the Belmonts. She calls them niggers and has no issue with completely disposing of her children and never seeing them again. Jim is Meg's lover and Fredo's father. He falls ill and eventually dies, leaving Meg alone, again with the responsibility of raising 2 children. Then we find Seth. Once a business partner in Jim's business, Seth marries Meg, and they abandon her 6-year-old Fredo to the Belmonts. Fredo's the protagonist of the novel. She's a pretty mulatto girl with a defiant personality. She is a well-developed, round character with many facets to her person. She is the servant to Miss Belmont and endures endless abuse and torture at the hands of Miss Belmont and her daughter Mary. However, she wins the love and affection of the other members of the family. Next, we see Mr. Belmont, the patriarch of the Belmont family. He is a kind and humble man who would not grudge hospitality to the poorest wanderer, nor fail to sympathize with any sufferer, however humble. Although his intentions towards Fredo are good, he does not exercise his ability as the patriarch to stop the cruel abuse against the child. Next, Miss Belmont, the matriarch of the Belmont family. She is a tyrannical and capricious woman who never shows any mercy towards Fredo. She is portrayed as an evil, racist woman with violent tendencies. Her personality does not show any variations. There is no personality behind her cruel actions. Miss Belmont also influences her daughter Mary to physically and verbally abuse Fredo. Mary, the youngest and most active daughter of the Belmonts, is in the household and novel. She is similar to her mother in that she mostly is there for senseless cruelty. At one point, she tries to kill Fredo with a knife in her intense anger. She always is trying to get her into trouble and only addresses her as nigger, or something equally rude. She abuses Fredo both physically and mentally. Then we see Jane, the eldest Belmont daughter. She is sickly and ill, though she is pursued by 2 men and eventually marries. She is very weak and can offer Fredo nothing but kind looks and sympathy. She is a kind and concerned individual and evokes a certain amount of sympathy for her situation. Jack, the youngest Belmont son, he is full of life and humor. He makes sure that Mrs. Belmont and Mary don't beat Fredo, at least when he's around. He displays kindness towards Fredo and deems her handsome and bright. He eventually leaves to pursue a career, as he is a very intelligent young man. Next we see James, who is the eldest son in their family. He is kind and, like Jack, provides shelter and comfort for Fredo. He is the one who offers Fredo some sort of way out, a release, if you will, in that he wants to take her away. Eventually, he takes after Jane. His health begins to fail, though he still does his best to remain in good humor and an encouragement for Fredo. He sees Fredo as an object of affection and more. The last person that we see in this story is Aunt Abby. She's the kind-hearted sister of Mr. Belmont. She is always ready and willing to provide a much-needed respite for the abused little Fredo. Oh, and we can't forget Fido. Fido is a dog bought by Jack for Fredo. Fido is a source of pleasure and friendship during Fredo's times of suffering. And we will go into our summary of the story. Arnig, Sketches from the Life of a Free Black by Harriet Wilson, is an autobiographical-based tale of a young mulatto girl, Fredo, who is abandoned by her socially shamed white mother when her black father dies. Wilson provides a bit of backstory, telling of Meg's disgrace. A wealthy suitor, the father of her unborn child, ditches her and leaves her to fend for herself. her child dies during birth, and how it sours her disposition into that of an uncaring woman and drives her to marry and reproduce with a generous, caring African-American man, Jim. Meg is forever ashamed of this final step into social rejection. After Jim dies, Meg pairs up with his business partner, Seth. When they are no longer able to support their entire group, Seth and Meg guiltlessly leave Fredo with the tyrannical Miss Belmont and never return. Fredo works from the age of 6 until she is 18 as an indentured servant for this white middle-class family in Boston. Fredo's life is riddled with misfortune. At a very young age, Fredo is committed to servitude in the Belmont residence, where she is met with cruelty and racial slurs. They call her Nig, or nigger, and beat her almost daily. The story is interesting because it shows a young, free, quote-unquote, half-white, half-black girl struggling with an unpleasant family who is still upbeat, interesting, and spunky. Fredo overcomes this submissive environment to develop her own personality. We find Mrs. Belmont and her youngest daughter, Mary, to be of the same mind and manner. They are rude, insensitive, racist, and very harsh on the endearing Fredo. A few years after she arrived, she is sent to school, which Mary greatly objects to, and begins to grow as a person. Mr. Belmont, Jack, and Jane are the more pleasant members of the family, although they are limited in their ability to shield her. Mr. Belmont is timid and does not like to test his word against Miss Belmont often. Jack is young and is often gone, leaving Fredo vulnerable. Jane, unfortunately, is an invalid and not strong enough to stand up to her mother. She finds her friends in Jack, Jane, James, when she meets him, and Aunt Abby, the kind sister of Mr. Belmont, and the dog that Jack gets her, Fido. Eventually, when Fredo meets James, the eldest Belmont son, he is a source of comfort and safety to her, and he promises that he will return so they may retrieve her and take her away with him. This notion is a great source of comfort to Fredo, and it helps her when James and then Jack and eventually even Jane leave. She becomes attached to her dog Fido, as Miss Belmont continues to abuse her. At this point, both James, who lives far away, and Fredo fall under the weather, and it begins to look like James may not be able to save her the way Fredo wishes for, as his help dwindles, though she holds on to the hope that he will take her away with him one day. However, illness forces James to return to his parents' home, where both his and Fredo's health decline. Fredo is grieved by the state that he is in because he cannot walk without a cane and can only stay in bed. But James still does his best to make sure that Fredo is not beaten. James is getting weaker and weaker, and soon passes away. As she grows older, Fredo prevents further beatings from Miss Belmont by threatening not to work. Feeling the stirring of free and independent thoughts, Fredo turns to books for comfort, and when she is 18, she is freed. Weak and sickly after the years of severe abuse, Fredo departs the Belmont household and tries desperately to earn a living on her own. Having very little with which to support herself, Fredo is employed in a number of different professions, but her failing health forces her to accept public charity intermittently. However, she gradually perfects her needlework skills and sews straw hats with a white woman who teaches Fredo more about sewing and shares her library with her. This brief period of Fredo's life is interrupted when a black man named Samuel comes to town on a fugitive slave lecture circuit. Fredo and Samuel marry, but Samuel often leaves his wife to lecture and eventually runs away to sea. When Fredo bears their son, Samuel returns for a short time, only to abandon them again and die of fever in New Orleans. She leaves her son in the care of a woman who found a place to rest, hoping to get better and gain an easier livelihood for herself and her child. That's a summary of the story, Our Nig. And as you can see, it pretty much resembles the life that Harriet E. Wilson had herself. On this slide, I pulled up a couple of quotes or a couple of passages that really stood out to me, that I thought really had depth and said something. In the preface, Harriet Wilson says, "I sincerely appealed to my colored brethren universally for patronage, hoping they will not condemn this attempt of their sister to be erudite, but rally around me a faithful band of supporters and defenders." She's calling out, please don't think I'm anything better than you. I just want help to get my son back. And which is her reason for writing this book, is to earn money to get her son back out of the poor farm where he has been sent to live, because she can't afford it. She can't afford to keep him. Chapter 1, page 3, she says, "God be thanked," ejaculated Mag as she saw its breathing cease. "No one can taunt her with my ruin." This section talks about how her first child died when she gave birth to her. The section that says, "No one can taunt her with my ruin," that's deep. That really says a whole lot, that she feels that her life was so bad that she's happy that her daughter had passed away. That way no one can pass that on to her. And it says that here, "Blessed release, may we all respond. How many pure, innocent children not only inherit a wicked heart of their own, claiming lifelong scrutiny and restraint, but are heirs also of parental disgrace and calumny, from which only long years of patient endurance and paths can restitude can disencumber them." Do we leave destruction, or do we leave behind things that our children must live with? Do we leave behind do we leave something for our children to have to clean up, for our children to have to live with after we're gone? In chapter 2, page 6, this said a lot to me. Giving her a weekly allowance, which furnished most of the food necessary for the 4 inmates. This talks after she's married with Seth and they are working. He comes and he gives her a weekly allowance. But what strikes me is how she says the 4 inmates. They were inmates in this world? Were they inmates in their home? Did she feel that they were so poor and so desolate, and that they were inmates? They were really just locked up into this poor life, and they had no way to get out. These are some of my references where I got some information. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all can find the time to read the whole story. It is a wonderfully emotional, truthful insight to the life of a quote-unquote indentured servant who was, by all accounts, an actual slave who was beaten just as the other slaves that they would normally keep outside, just because she lived in the home and was given a couple years of schooling. Did that really change? Did that really change the fact that by saying indentured house servant, does that really change the fact that she was an actual slave? Thank you.